Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining me earlier with District 6 Councilman Lauren Taylor talking about the verdict. And we're going to talk about the verdict yet again with my longtime friend, John Russo, who has been Oakland City Council member, District 2, Oakland's first elected city attorney, reelected 3 times, city manager for Alameda, Riverside, and Irvine, and now the founder and president of Synchronicity Associates. Uh, so I can't think of anybody better to turn to talk about this because we talked about this in a lot of different ways over the long time we've known each other. But what do you think about the verdict, John?
Absolutely the correct verdict, especially under Minnesota law. It's second-degree murder under Minnesota law. And I'm just grateful that the jury came back and that they came back quickly with what I think most of us, in large part thanks to the person who took the tape that showed how long the officer in question was on Mr. Floyd's neck. I don't see how you could have come to a different verdict unless impermissible, what we all believe to be, those of us who believe in justice, to believe in are impermissible considerations.
What do we do? And I was talking with Councilman Taylor about this, I call it giant MAW, MAW, that, among other things, is designed in total to take in black men into the system, but it starts with the narrative that you did something wrong. It starts with the narrative that's a lie on its face. And I've been through it. A number of black men have been through it. And then it goes from, like, for example, I can just pick one. 2006, I'm coming back from the Balboa Cafe. I'm being tailgated by a guy I don't know why to this day. I'm thinking, hey, there's a highway patrol officer. I'll go to him for help. So I go and deliberately go in front of him, waving him and saying, get this guy. The guy goes by me at 80 miles per hour, doesn't go after him, stays behind me. We get off the bridge. They flash their lights. I said, hey, I was trying to get my urine. And they stopped me and says, well, we're going to get you out of here. Don't worry. Next thing you know, he's like, hands my hand. He's handcuffing me. And I'm thinking, seriously? And he breathalyzes me. And says I was over the limit. I wasn't. And then as tears roll down my eyes, he grabs my entire body and body slams me on the squad car. And then because of that, basically wrote in the police report that I delayed arrest. I'm thinking, how did I delay arrest when you made me a hit ornament on your car?
Right.
I mean, when does this stop? And I find that people, they almost seem to delight in telling lies about black men. And it gets us back to Emmett Till and everything else. Remember Amy Cooper last year? Were it not for a cell phone, Chris Cooper might have been beat up by the New York cops.
Right. Well, look, there are a lot of things that can be done. There's not going to be. I mean, when you consider how many hundreds of years racism, particularly with respect to African American men, has been institutionalized in a number of different ways, some very visible and manifest, like you saw with the officer killing Mr. Floyd, but in other ways that are not so easy to see, that are not manifest, in terms of where investment takes place, insurance rates, all kinds of things. When you look at all of that, I think the reality that we face is there will not be a quick fix, but there can be positive and visibly positive evolution. And it can happen in front of our eyes. It doesn't need to be what I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting, wait, it'll happen, people will evolve. People will not evolve. In fact, they can devolve, as you've seen in the past 5 years, when you had a president that gave permission, in effect, to people to say a bunch of stupid, idiotic stuff that they were thinking. Now, there's a lot of people who feel like maybe we were done a favor by outing all of that. But I think standards are standards. And as people start to believe that it's okay, that it's somehow an expression of freedom to express racist ignorance, that's not okay. But let me get back to policing particularly, because as you know, as city attorney, not only was I out front on a lot of police reforms, but I also had the duty to defend police officers in cases. So I've actually been on all sides of this and seen it from different positions. So let me start by saying that the biggest problem with policing is the inability to recruit people from the community that's being patrolled. And that inability is not it's not a force of nature. It is how the policy is set up, not for evil reasons, but it turns out to have negative impacts. For example, for years in Oakland, at least, and I don't know what the numbers are today. I know what the numbers were from 1995 till about 2010. More than 90% of the police officers that work in Oakland did not live in Oakland. And the counter argument to that, when I would speak to the Police Officers Association or the union, was, well, we don't want to live in the city where we're patrolling because we could run in, or our families could run into people that we had busted, and it's a safety issue for us. That was nonsense. That was an excuse. In Riverside, which didn't have the same level of crime problem that Oakland had, but Riverside is not Beverly Hills either. Overwhelming majority of the police lived in Riverside. And yet, and Riverside had gangs. Riverside had very tough neighborhoods. Riverside was a centralized police department, so if you were responding to calls, you would be in those tougher neighborhoods. It's not that big of a city. It's 320,000 people that as a police officer you would be able to hide. And yet, Riverside police did live in Riverside. And Riverside police had many, many fewer complaints than Oakland did. Now, I'm not saying they were perfect. They weren't. But it's a question of the culture of the department. And it is at once a case-by-case affair, but it's also an issue of how the police and the police unions view their role vis-a-vis training. Do they see training as and physical activity requirements? Do they see those things as a burden to be fought, or do they see them as a benefit to ensure that the person who's the police officer next to them is going to be properly trained, is going to be able to do what needs to be done when that moment arrives, and not act out of fear because they're in good enough physical condition to meet whatever that physical challenge is without reaching for the weapon. And so that varies from city to city. And so when there's an attempt to paint all police officers with a broad brush, I think that needs to be rejected as well. And that's not going to get us where we want to go. A, because it will create a reaction, but that's not the main reason. B, because it demonstrates a misunderstanding of what the problem is. Last point, you mentioned about young black men. Leo Bazil, who you remember and I remember and is still around.
Yeah, he's on my show.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Leo Bazil used to say back in the late 80s, and I was really, I felt like my eyes were open to this. Leo Bazil said, they say crime doesn't pay, but it pays the police officer, it pays the prosecutor, it pays the judge, it pays the public defender, it pays the bailiff, it pays, and he went through a list of all the people for whom crime paid. Mm-hmm. The tragedy is that whether you're on the side of the prosecution or you're on the side of the defense, it's an entire mill, and it needs grist for the mill. And unfortunately, the grist for the mill has been and continues to be largely young African American men.
But John, you realize you're saying that taxpayers are funding the mill.
Well, they are. They are. And some of them understand this and some of them don't. And some of them come up with, silly items like, well, why would people be upset? Why are people upset when a police officer shoots a young black man when young black men shoot more young black men than police officers do? The whole issue about so-called black on black crime. Well, by that logic, you have white on white crime. More white people are killed by white people than by anybody else. So the point is what? The point is a distraction. And what we need to be focused on is how do we not defund the police? I think that's a really unfortunate approach to it. But how do we reimagine public safety? And if we look at it in a positivistic way, I'm not even sure that's a word, but in a positive way, how do we reimagine public safety in a way that is more community-based, where the community produces its own policing through an authority? I'm not into the idea that we're just going to pull the state out altogether. But if you deal with it from the point of view of a policing force that is, yes, it's there to implement the law, but what it's really there is to help people live better lives and to assist with that and to be a part of that community and a respected part of that community, that's where we need to be going. And that's all about better psychological profiling of the people we hire, hiring more people from the community and not eliminating vast numbers of young men who are from more challenged neighborhoods because when they were 16 or 17, they might have gotten caught up in selling weed or something when it was illegal. I mean, silly stuff that really shouldn't disqualify you any more than a speeding ticket would disqualify you. Because, the counter argument is, well, then you show you weren't willing to obey the law. Well, by that logic, when I run a stop sign, I've shown I haven't been able to demonstrate that I will obey the law. So we need to really dispose of the phony arguments about why things are as they are and focus on how we can make things better through a more cooperative venture in policing. So how do you reimagine public safety? And that's where I think we need to go.
So basically, that gives, I think for me, an entirely different perspective of defunding the police in terms of taking money out of a system that's inherently racist, because there are some who, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, believe that regardless of whether or not you take a good cop or a bad cop out of it, you still have a bad policing structure, right?
Well, right, but by that logic, whether if you think, as I do, that the way we deal with prescription drugs versus non-prescription drugs in America, and how we fund it and how we deal with it, if you think that that system is a mess, the answer is not to stop creating life-saving drugs.
Right.
The answer is to reform the system. It's so much easier to appeal to anger, legitimate anger, totally legitimate, which makes it even harder. It's so much easier to appeal to that and look like a hero doing that. But if you're really wanting to make things better, if you really want to get at the front end where the racist nature of the society has its cutting edge, it's at the police.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to address that, but you don't address it by opening the dialogue with, we're going to get rid of all police, or all policing is wrong, or
Right.
all policing is a problem. It's politically not feasible. And it's, even if it were feasible, it's not wise. Whether or not you're talking America or any other, there's a reason why there are police forces throughout the world in every type of culture. We give a piece of our individual agency over to the state, right? Not the state of California, the state, the city.
Yeah,
we give a piece of our individual agency there in order to maintain peace and order so that we can all go about doing the things we want to do. If you had no police, who protects you from, vicious racists? You can say, well, the police were often in cahoots, say, in the past with the Klan in parts of the country, and that's true. But the answer is not to not have police. The answer is to reform the police.
Right.
So, but I can understand why people hear that instead of hearing what someone like me would be saying. What they might, who is an ally, they might hear, well, you're a white dude, so you're just saying wait, and we've been waiting too long, and it's a legitimate anger behind that. I acknowledge that.
I guess for me, well, let me take the I guess out of my sentence. I'm confused to this day where we went from what for me would have been the ideal outcome. You get rid of bad cops.
Mm-hmm.
Cop watch. Everybody has a smartphone. They're on the lookout to put some cop who's bad on camera to make some money, right?
Mm-hmm.
Two, just defunding the police. It seems like, and which costs, because I'm 3,000 miles away from the West Coast right now, which costs us a bunch of seats in the House.
Absolutely. Well, and you heard, the day after the election, the House Democrats had a conference call, the House Caucus, and they had a big shouting match between the sort of self-described progressive wing, right, with those folks who are in swing seats. And the reality is, in politics, politicians either want to get something done, in which case they are trying to frame an issue, and you don't have to give up any of your principles. But, I think I've started teaching, right? I've started teaching public policy. Yeah. And what I've been really trying to drill into my students, and, they're 18, 19, 20, they're just as idealistic as I was at that age. What I'm drilling into them is, the people who are on your side are on your side. It's the people that aren't paying attention, or the people that are skeptical of what you're proposing. You have to meet them where they live. Mm-hmm. So we have a large number of people like you, like me, who know that there are things that need to be changed, and that the consequences of not changing them in policing are fatal, particularly often to Black men. But you don't make change by alienating people who are either on the fence or are less understanding of that anger. You turn them away, you turn them off. You don't need to compromise one bit on what you're proposing. But when you start with defund the police, you make people frightened. Right? Now, you say, but
especially
are already frightened. Right?
Yeah.
Yes, agreed. So how does it help? So what's happened with politics in general, this issue is emblematic of where we are. Do you, as an elected official policymaker, try to build coalitions, which means people who don't think like you do? Because if not, it's not a coalition. It's all your people already with you. Or are you appealing to the people who already agree with you because you want that, oh, you are so, you just tell them, yeah, go, you go.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a question of, are people in this to make things better, or are people in this to look like someone who wants to make things better? And I think a lot of what has happened, I think Black Lives Matter, great phrase. I know people say, well, all lives matter. Nonsense. That's nonsense. The Constitution says, all men are created equal, so all didn't count.
Right.
For black. So to me, that's folks who may or may not be, understanding what the true nature of how vicious American history has been for African Americans throughout the history, not just up until 1865. But defund the police, I can't get behind that. Now, you tell me reform the police, okay, but I don't think that's enough. I think it's about reimagining how public safety is delivered, and that's not just about police. So you want to say defund? When we said defund, we meant maybe police shouldn't be handling mental health issues. Maybe police shouldn't be handling this or that other function. Okay, but that's not defunding the police. That's reimagining public safety. Defunding the police sounds like you just don't want to fund the police. You didn't say cut the police budget. You said defund.
Right.
And to the average person who has a home or property to protect or kids and that, defund the police more likely than not is a turnoff.
I want to get your thoughts as we move to a close out of respect for your time, although
Thank you.
My time is yours. What do you think of, and I'm assuming you didn't hear about this, but today the city of Berkeley mayor, Jesse Argoin, had said that they are going to stop having police officers write tickets for such things as a broken tailpipe or a broken taillight, and that sort of thing, as a way of, taking out an entire section of behavior that all too often catches folks who look like me, even though I don't have, broken taillight,
Well, okay. So I think it's a workaround to be sure. I think I understand that the concept here is so people with less money are more likely to have broken tailpipes and still be driving around with it. And therefore, kind of coming at it backwards, since we know that due to institutional racism, people of color tend to have less money, have less wealth. So you're figuring, you're getting at this, you're limiting the number of contacts between the police, or you're trying to damp down the number of contacts between the police and people of color for things that don't have to do with, say, violent crime or stealing things or anything like that. That's fine. But it's a Band-Aid, right? Because really you should be able to rely that your officers are not just stopping people based on profiling when they stop them for a broken tailpipe. And there's a reason we have laws about broken tailpipes that have to do with the environment. So I appreciate that the mayor's intentions here are good, and it's a way to try to help protect people. But my feeling is you need to focus on the actual problem, which is the fact that there are not by any stretch a majority, but too many police officers who really shouldn't have been selected to be police officers in the first place, based upon either their unacceptable beliefs about race relations or just out of their psychological profile that they're in policing because they're attracted to the occasional physical violence that comes with it. That's their thing. And again, let me be clear. I've defended Oakland police officers as much as anybody, I think what a tough relationship I had, particularly with the police union. But But I've also had great relations with police chiefs over the years. If they're police chiefs that believe in proper training, and by training, again, I don't just mean physical training or training about how to implement policy. I'm talking about training about accepting all people and treating all people with respect, and treating them properly, and treating them as peers, really, not someone that you can like smack around as you got thrown around. There's just no reason to treat someone like that. It's.
He didn't. Bill Dubois was my attorney. He didn't show up to court twice.
Well, yeah, I can't get better lawyers. I don't know what to tell you.
Hey, John, we've got to have you back because we got to talk about, wow, Al Davis in the NFL. From your perspective, you lived it too.
Yeah, I did.
Everything
Saw
else.
the scars.
Yeah. Stick around backstage. Hey, folks, we'll be back with more. We'll be focusing on the Oscars later tonight. So it's Oscar Sunday. Who's your best picture, John? You got a selection?
No, I'm totally zoned out of that. I'm so sorry.
Unbelievable.
I don't even have a choice.
Stop the press. Stick around the backstage, folks. Subscribe to Zenny62 and bookmark oaklandnewsnow.com. That ends this